Okay, let's face a damn chest. Slut from China. Street war. Suck my slut. Suck my slut. Who's this hits me? This hits me. This hits me. God fucking. I'm gonna play a damn 5 minutes. Look at this horse shit. You suck my dick, bitch. Suck my slut. You suck my dick, bitch. Suck my slut.
Here's something no one likes to admit. If doubt truly disappeared, faith wouldn't exist. Which raises a strange problem.
Suck?
Why do so many belief systems treat doubt like the enemy when they secretly depend on it? If you've ever felt that quiet tension you can't explain, you're not alone. But the real question is, what is that feeling actually trying to show you?
Suck?
The thought you weren't supposed to have.
Bitch.
Most people think doubt is a failure, like a crack in the system, a sign something went wrong somewhere along the way. You start believing, then a question appears, and suddenly it feels like you broke something that was supposed to stay intact. Makes sense, right? If belief is strong, doubt should be gone. That is the assumption. But that is not how the mind works. Doubt is not an accident. It is not a glitch that slipped past the design. It is part of the design itself. Your brain is built to question things, constantly scanning for gaps, inconsistencies, and risks. Not just random things either. The more important something is to your life, the more attention your mind gives it. And what could be more important than belief? Something that shapes your choices, your morals, your idea of right and wrong. Even what you think happens after you die. Your brain does not look at that and relax. It leans in closer. It checks again. Then again. Think about it in simple terms. You double-check the door lock before going to sleep. Not because you doubt every lock in the world, but because this one matters. Now take that instinct and apply it to something much bigger than a door. Something that defines your entire worldview. That quiet doubt you feel from time to time is not weakness. It is not a sign you are failing. It is your mind doing quality control on the most important structure in your life. It is asking, very calmly, is this solid enough to stand on? And here is where things start to feel uncomfortable. Religion does not remove that system. It cannot. The questioning part of your mind does not switch off just because you decide to believe. So instead of eliminating doubt, something else has to happen. It has to be managed, redirected, sometimes even hidden. And that raises a question most people avoid asking. If doubt is built into you from the start, what does it mean when a belief system tells you it should not be there at all? Certainty feels good, but it's not natural. People do not just believe, they want to believe. There is a difference, and it matters more than most realize. Belief answers questions, but certainty removes the need to ask them at all. And that feeling is powerful. It is clean, simple, stable. No second guessing, no mental noise, no late night spirals that keep you staring at the ceiling. Just answers. It feels like finally getting the instruction manual for life after years of guessing your way through it. Like assembling a piece of furniture and realizing, for once, all the screws are going exactly where they should. No leftover parts, no wobbling table, no quiet suspicion you did something wrong. Everything fits. Feels good, right? But here's the problem. The human brain is not designed for permanent certainty. It is designed for survival. And survival depends on staying alert, questioning, adjusting. A brain that never questions anything is not peaceful. It is vulnerable. Think about it. If our ancestors simply accepted everything as safe and true, they would not last long. The brain learned to scan for threats, for inconsistencies, for things that do not quite add up. That system never turned off. It just became more subtle. Now place that same brain inside a belief system that promises certainty. You get tension. Not always loud, not always obvious, but there. Because one part of the mind wants stability, while another part keeps asking quiet questions. That is why even deeply religious people have moments where something does not sit right. It might be a verse that feels harsh, a rule that seems outdated, or a contradiction that does not fully resolve. Nothing dramatic. Just a small pause.
Suck my slut. Oh my God.
They do not always say it out loud. In fact, most do not. It is often brushed aside, explained away, or simply ignored. Not because the question disappeared, but because it is easier to move past it than to follow it all the way through. So doubt does not vanish in the presence of certainty. It gets managed, softened, pushed into the background. And that leads to something worth paying attention to. If certainty feels so natural, why does it require so much effort to maintain it? Doubt doesn't die, it gets redirected. Here is what actually happens, and it is more subtle than most people realize. Doubt does not vanish. It does not dissolve or fade away with stronger belief. It shifts direction. Quietly, almost invisibly. Instead of questioning the belief itself, people begin to question themselves. You have probably heard the thoughts before, maybe even in your own head. Maybe I do not understand it properly. Maybe I am missing something obvious. Maybe my faith is not strong enough. Maybe I am the problem. Sound familiar? Notice what just happened there. The original question was pointing outward, toward the belief. Now it has been turned inward, toward the person. The spotlight moved, but the tension stayed. This is not random. It is a very efficient psychological move, because it allows the belief system to remain untouched while still giving doubt a place to exist. The system stays stable, and the discomfort gets absorbed by the individual. On the surface, it even looks like humility. Questioning yourself can feel responsible, even virtuous. It sounds like growth. Like you are trying to improve, to understand more deeply, to become better. But underneath that, something else is happening. The original question never got answered. It just got redirected. And that comes with a cost. Because now the tension is no longer about ideas or truth. It becomes personal. It becomes about your worth, your intelligence, your ability to believe correctly. Instead of asking, is this true? You start asking, what is wrong with me? That is a much heavier question to carry. One question invites exploration, the other invites self-doubt in a much deeper sense. And here is the strange part. The more someone tries to silence doubt by turning it inward, the stronger that internal pressure becomes. Because you are no longer just managing a question. You are managing your identity. So the doubt does not go away. It just changes shape. And once it becomes personal, it is much harder to face directly. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If doubt has to be redirected just to keep belief stable, what does that say about the belief itself? The fear behind the question. Let's be honest for a second. Doubt is not just intellectual. It is emotional. And that changes everything. Because questioning belief is not like questioning a random fact. It is not like wondering if you remembered to turn off the stove. It reaches deeper than that. When you question belief, you are touching something tied to your identity, your community, your sense of safety, even your idea of what happens after death. That is not a small thing. It is closer to pulling a single thread on a sweater and suddenly realizing the whole thing might come apart. And nobody wants to stand there in the cold, holding loose yarn, wondering what just happened. So the reaction is not calm curiosity. It is tension, sometimes fear, even if it is quiet and hard to name. Because the question is not just about truth anymore. It becomes about what happens to your world if that question leads somewhere uncomfortable. Think about what is at stake. Your relationships, your belonging, the structure that helps you make sense of life. Even the idea that everything will be okay in the end. When doubt touches those areas, it stops feeling like a simple thought. It feels like a risk. So what do people do? They do not eliminate doubt. That would require answering it fully, and that path can feel too uncertain. Instead, they contain it. They set boundaries around it, without even realizing they are doing it. They ignore certain questions. They distract themselves when uncomfortable thoughts appear. They label doubt as dangerous or misleading, something to avoid rather than explore. Not because it is false, but because it is powerful. That distinction matters. If doubt were weak, it would not need to be controlled. It would fade on its own. The fact that it does not fade, the fact that it keeps returning in quiet moments, tells you something important. It has weight, and maybe the real reason it feels threatening is not because it breaks belief, but because it forces you to see how much of your life is built on it. And once you see that clearly, it becomes much harder to pretend the question does not matter. Why strong believers still feel it. You might think the most faithful people do not struggle with doubt, that they reached a level where the questions stopped, where everything finally settled into place. From the outside, it can look that way. Calm, confident, certain. But often, the reality is very different. They are not free from doubt. In many cases, they are managing it more carefully than anyone else. Not because they are pretending or being dishonest, but because they understand exactly what is at stake. When your entire worldview depends on something being true, even a small crack matters. Not just intellectually, but personally. It is not about being right. It is about whether the foundation of your life holds up under pressure. That changes how you respond to doubt. It becomes something you monitor closely, something you keep contained, not ignored completely, but not allowed to spread either. Like hearing a strange noise in your car engine, you notice it. You know it is there, but instead of pulling over immediately, you turn up the radio and keep driving. Not because you do not care, but because stopping would mean facing something you are not ready to deal with. And deep down, you know that noise means something needs attention. Here is where
This is
the
boring!
more someone invests in their belief, the more they build their identity, relationships, and sense of meaning around it, the more sensitive they become to even the smallest doubt. Not less, more. Because there is more to protect. A casual belief can be questioned without much consequence, but a belief that shapes your entire life cannot be challenged so easily. The cost feels too high, so the system becomes more guarded. That is why strong believers do not have less doubt. They have more at stake when it appears. And instead of disappearing, doubt becomes something they learn to manage with precision, carefully, quietly, often without ever speaking it out loud. Which leads to a deeper question. If the strength of belief increases the need to control doubt, is it really removing uncertainty, or just becoming better at containing it? The system needs doubt to exist. Now this is where it flips, and most people never stop to notice it. Doubt is not just tolerated in religion, it is necessary. That sounds wrong at first, almost backwards, because doubt is usually framed as the threat, the thing that weakens belief, the thing you are supposed to overcome. But look closer, and something strange appears. Belief only has meaning if there is uncertainty. If something were 100% provable, measurable, undeniable, it would not require faith. It would simply be accepted as fact. No tension, no choice, no leap, just recognition. Nobody praises you for believing in gravity. You do not wake up in the morning and say, "Today I will have strong faith in gravity." You just do not jump off buildings. The question never even enters your mind, because there is nothing to question. Faith does not work like that. Faith exists in a space where certainty is incomplete, where evidence is not final, where questions still have room to exist. That space is not a flaw in the system. It is the system, which means doubt is not standing outside belief, trying to break in. It is already inside, shaping the conditions that make belief possible, Think about it. If there were no doubt at all, belief would not feel like belief.
Suck my motherfucker.
It would feel like observation. Like accepting the color of the sky, or the fact that water is wet. There would be no commitment, no trust, no meaning attached to the act of believing. Doubt creates the gap, and faith steps into it. That is what gives belief its weight, not the absence of questions, but the decision to continue despite them. That is what people admire when they talk about strong faith.
Man, this fucking sucks.
Something about the story never quite sits right, does it? You're told it was the most important moment in human history, and yet, no one can actually agree on what happened next. Not the witnesses, not the writers, not even the believers.
Oh my God, I can't.
And the strange part is, the more you look, the less certain it becomes. So, what actually happened after Jesus Christ died?
Oh my God!
Let's go step by step. Because this isn't just history, it's psychology. The silence no one talks about. Right after the crucifixion, something unexpected happens. Not a dramatic moment, not a clear continuation of the story. Instead, there is a strange kind of silence. The narrative does not flow the way you would expect if everything were part of a known plan. It feels interrupted. What we see instead is confusion. The followers are not standing strong, waiting for a promised return. They are scattered, afraid. Some are hiding behind locked doors. Others disappear from the scene entirely. This is not the behavior of people who are confident that victory is just around the corner, which raises an uncomfortable question. If they truly understood what was going to happen, why did everything collapse the moment he died? Think about your own life for a second. If you are absolutely certain that something good will happen in 3 days, you do not panic when things look bad. You hold on, you stay steady, you wait. But that is not what happens here. They react like people who have just lost everything. Their teacher, their hope, their expectations about the future, gone. And not in a symbolic way, in a very real, very final way.
You hooker.
And this is where the story becomes more human than most people expect. Because it suggests they did not fully understand what they were part of. Not in the moment, not when it mattered most. It is easy, looking back, to connect the dots and see a clear narrative. But inside the moment, it feels different, messy, uncertain. Almost like watching something fall apart without knowing how to stop it. And maybe that is the detail that gets overlooked. The story does not begin with confidence. It begins with shock. The empty tomb problem. You've heard it your whole life. The tomb was empty, simple, clean, powerful. It sounds like the kind of detail that settles everything in one sentence. Case closed. But the moment you slow down and actually look at the accounts, something starts to feel off. They do not match. Who arrived at the tomb first? In some versions, it is one woman. In others, several. The names change depending on who is telling the story. That might seem small, but details like that usually matter when people are describing something extraordinary. Then there is the stone. Was it already rolled away when they got there, or did it happen in front of them? You would think something that dramatic would be remembered the same way every time, but it is not. And then it gets even stranger. Were there angels present? 1, 2, a young man, a shining figure, or no clear description at all? The accounts shift depending on which version you read. The core claim stays the same, but the surrounding details move around it like loose pieces. Now, pause for a second. If multiple people witness the same event, you expect small differences. That is normal. But here, the differences are not just small. They shape the entire scene. And this is where it becomes uncomfortable. Because an empty tomb, by itself, does not prove a resurrection. It proves one thing only. The body was not there. That leaves room for many explanations. A miracle is one of them. But it is not the only one. Bodies can be moved. Graves can be disturbed. Stories can form around events that no one fully understood at the time. History is full of moments like that. And once that door opens, even slightly, the story begins to split, not into truth and lies, but into possibilities. And people tend to choose the one that gives the story meaning. Visions or encounters? After the death, people begin to report something strange. They see him, Not as one large public event, not as a moment that settles everything at once. It happens in fragments. One person here, a small group there, different places, different times. And the details are not as clean as you might expect. Sometimes they recognize him instantly, as if nothing has changed. Other times they hesitate, they talk to him, walk with him, and only later realize who they believe he is. That is unusual. If someone you know well stands in front of you, recognition is immediate. You do not need a delayed realization. That detail alone makes the situation more complex than it first appears. And here is something that is rarely brought into the conversation. Grief can do this. Psychologists have documented it for a long time. After losing someone close, the mind does not simply accept the absence and move on. It resists. It searches. It tries to restore what was lost. In that process, people can have vivid experiences. They see the person, hear their voice, even feel their presence in a way that is deeply convincing. Not imaginary in the sense of being dismissed, real in the sense of being felt. Completely real. Now pause and think about the situation these followers were in. They had not just lost a teacher, they had lost a purpose, a future they believed in, a sense that something bigger was unfolding. If several people are carrying that kind of emotional weight at the same time, is it impossible that their experiences might begin to overlap? That conversations reinforce memories, and memories reinforce belief? Human beings are not isolated observers. We influence each other constantly, especially in moments of uncertainty. And this is the key point. Recognizing this does not mean calling anyone a liar. It does not mean dismissing their sincerity. In fact, it points in the opposite direction. It suggests they were genuine. They experienced something. The real question is not whether they believed it. It is what kind of experience it actually was. The stories start changing. As time passes, the story does not stay still. It grows. The edges become sharper. The scenes feel more solid, more detailed, more certain. At first, the reports are brief, almost restrained. Then gradually, new elements begin to appear. The encounters become more physical, more grounded in the body. He is no longer just seen. He eats. He speaks at length. He invites people to touch his wounds, as if to remove any doubt that this is something real and not imagined. It starts to feel less like an experience and more like evidence. But here's the strange part. If you go back to the earliest writings, especially those connected to Paul the Apostle, the tone is different. The descriptions are less concrete, more like appearances, more like something seen or revealed, rather than something physically interacted with in detail. There is no long scene of shared meals, no careful emphasis on touch. The experience feels closer to a vision than a physical meeting. So something shifts over time, and that raises a difficult question. What changed between the earliest accounts and the later ones? One possibility is simple and very human. Stories evolve. Not because people sit down and decide to invent things, but because memory is not a perfect recording. It is flexible. It adapts. It reshapes itself around what feels meaningful. When people retell something important, they do not just repeat facts. They emphasize what matters. They clarify what feels unclear. They strengthen what seems fragile. And slowly, without anyone necessarily intending it, the story becomes more complete than it originally was. Because meaning has a way of filling empty spaces. If something feels too vague, it becomes more concrete. If something feels uncertain, it becomes more defined. Not to deceive, but to make sense of it. And once that process begins, it is very hard to stop. The story does not just get told, it gets refined. The need for certainty. Now step out of history for a moment and look at something closer. Human nature. You have probably felt it yourself, more than once. That quiet discomfort when something does not make sense. Not a loud panic, just a steady pressure in the back of your mind. The kind that keeps tapping until you resolve it. It says, just give me a clear answer. We do not like loose ends. We do not sit comfortably with confusion. Even small things bother us. A missing item, an unanswered message, a story that does not fully add up. Now imagine that feeling, but applied to something much bigger. Your entire sense of direction, a belief about how the world
You
works.
say that, damn bitch.
That is the position the early followers
Shut
found
up!
themselves in. Their leader was gone, not in a symbolic way, gone in a way that left no room for negotiation. And with him went everything they thought was about to happen. The future they expected did not arrive. The plan they believed in collapsed in front of them. So, what does the mind do in a moment like that? It tries to restore order, not slowly, not carefully. It does it in the fastest and most effective way possible. It reshapes the event into something that makes sense again. Because a meaningless loss is hard to carry. It just sits there, heavy and unresolved. But a loss with purpose, that is different. That can be explained. That can be justified. So the story begins to shift. Not he died, but he had to die. Not we lost him, but this was part of something larger. And eventually, not he is gone, but he returned. Notice what is happening here. The facts are not simply being remembered. They are being interpreted in a way that removes chaos. And that shift is powerful, because it does not just answer questions. It relieves tension. It turns confusion into clarity, fear into direction. This is not only about belief, it is about survival at a psychological level. When reality breaks apart, the mind builds something that can hold it together again, the movement that shouldn't exist. Here is where things take a turn that feels almost impossible to explain. Despite the confusion, the fear, the scattered followers, the story does not fade, it grows. Not slowly,
He's
not
bringing out that
quietly,
whore!
but with a kind of momentum that seems completely out of proportion to how it started. The movement does not die,
Get that
it
whore out of here!
expands. And that immediately creates a powerful argument in people's minds. Something extraordinary must have happened. That is the conclusion many arrive at, almost instinctively. Because movements built on confusion usually collapse. They do not spread across regions, cultures, and eventually, empires. So it feels like there must be a moment, some undeniable event that explains everything. And maybe there was. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. Extraordinary does not automatically mean supernatural. It can also mean psychological. History is full of examples where small groups, deeply convinced of something, changed the direction of entire societies. Not because they had perfect evidence, but because they had unshakable belief. And belief, when it reaches a certain intensity, becomes contagious. Think about how ideas spread even today. A single narrative, repeated with conviction, can move through thousands, then millions. Not everyone checks the details. Most people respond to confidence, to certainty, to the feeling that something important is happening. Now imagine that in a time without modern distractions, without competing explanations at every turn, a small group, claiming they witnessed something profound, something that redefined death itself. That kind of message does not stay contained. It travels. Not because it is proven, but because it is powerful. And once it begins to spread, something interesting happens. The growth itself becomes part of the proof. People look at the expanding movement and think, this would not be happening if it were not true. But that is a psychological loop. Because strong belief does not need to wait for facts. In many cases, it moves ahead of them. And once it does, it becomes very hard to stop. The one detail people ignore. There's one detail that almost no one spends time on, even though it might be the most revealing part of the entire story. The facts do not line up perfectly. The timelines shift, the details change depending on who is speaking. But underneath all of that, something remains consistent. The emotion, fear turns into conviction, doubt hardens into certainty, confusion settles into clarity, and that shift is not subtle. It is dramatic. You go from people hiding behind doors to people standing in public, willing to defend what they believe no matter the cost. That kind of transformation does not come from casual opinion. It comes from something that feels deeply real to the person experiencing it. And this is where the focus usually goes in the wrong direction. Most people argue about what exactly happened. Was it physical? Was it spiritual? Was it something else entirely? But very few stop and ask why the emotional shift is so strong and so consistent. Because that part is not debated. It is visible in the behavior that follows. And here's why that matters. Human beings do not build their lives around abstract uncertainty. They build them around what feels true at a deep level. Once that feeling locks in, it becomes incredibly stable, not because it has been tested from every angle, but because it resolves something inside. It gives direction. It removes hesitation. It replaces questions with answers that feel complete. And once someone reaches that state, they do not just believe quietly. They act. They speak. They influence others. So whatever happened in those early moments, whether it was misunderstood, interpreted, or experienced in a way we no longer fully grasp, it created a shift that went beyond information. It changed people from the inside out. And sometimes, that is all a belief needs. Not perfect consistency, not universal agreement. Just enough internal certainty to keep moving forward, no matter what stands in the way. So, what actually happened? Here is the uncomfortable truth. We do not know. Not in the clean, satisfying way people often expect. There is no single version that everyone agrees on. No timeline that lines up perfectly from beginning to end. No account that settles every question without leaving something unresolved. Instead, what we have is a collection of perspectives, fragments that were written, shared, remembered, and reshaped over time. Each one carries pieces of memory, interpretation, emotion, and meaning, all woven together in ways that are difficult to separate. And that makes things messy, because history, especially ancient history, is rarely a perfect record. It is closer to a layered story. One layer sits on top of another, each shaped by the people telling it and the context they were living in. Over time, rough edges get smoothed out, unclear parts become clearer. Not always because new facts appear, but because belief fills in what is missing. So the story becomes polished. Not necessarily more accurate, but more meaningful. And this is where something deeper comes into focus. The story is not held together by evidence alone. It is held together by human need. The need for hope when things feel final. The need for justice when the world feels unfair. The need to believe that death is not the end of everything. These are not small needs. They are some of the strongest forces in human psychology. And when a story speaks directly to those needs, it does not just survive. It endures. It spreads. It becomes part of how people understand reality itself. So maybe the reason the story lasted is not because everyone agreed on the details. In fact, they did not. Maybe it lasted because, despite the differences, it offered something people were already searching for. Not certainty in every fact, but meaning where there was none before. So the real question isn't just, what happened after he died? It's this: why did so many people come to believe something so different, with so much certainty? Because when you understand that, you're no longer just studying history. You're looking directly at how belief is built. And once you see that, you can't unsee it.
What? Dumbass. I'm fucking you up. Suck my slut. Stupid. Since I can't win, I have to take a fucking drink. Son of a slut.
I'm going to start this video with a confession that might disturb you. You have been deceived many times. And the most disturbing thing is that you didn't even slut! I'm not talking about financial scams. I'm not talking about lies from ex-boyfriends, broken political promises, misleading advertisements on television. I'm talking about a deception that runs much deeper. A deception so old that it has been passed down from generation to generation, from father to son, from grandmother to grandson, from church to believer, from teacher to student, from journalist to viewer, for at least 5,000 years. A deception so well woven into human culture that most people live their entire lives without ever suspecting it. This deception has a name. It is called fear of the end. And I want to prove to you, in the next few minutes, that you have been a victim of it. I have too. Your parents, your grandparents, all human beings who have ever walked this planet have been. And the proof is so simple, so evident, so blatant, that when you see it for the first time, you feel a kind of vertigo, as if the ground shifted for a second beneath you. Look at this list with me. Year 999. Medieval
I'm getting in
Europe.
your business!
Crowds sell everything they have and walk to Jerusalem, certain that the world will end at the turn of the millennium. It didn't happen. Year 1666, London. Preachers announce in public squares that the end is marked for that year because of the number of...
Stupid!
Year 1844, United States. Tens of thousands of people
getting
wear
in your
white robes,
business!
climb
I'm getting in
hills,
your
abandon
business.
possessions and families, waiting to be taken up to heaven. It didn't happen. Year 1910, the entire Earth. Global panic when Halley's Comet passes close to our planet and false astronomers promise collective poisoning. It didn't happen. Year 2000, the Millennium Bug. Families stockpile food, water, candles, weapons. Governments spend billions. It didn't happen. Year 2012, Mayan calendar. The whole world trembled waiting for December 21st. It didn't happen. And I could go on for hours, listing predictions from ufologists, cults, television channels, modern prophets, digital influencers, all failing, all wrong, all promising the same abyss that never arrives. And yet, look at you. Look at us. Still feeling the same flutter in your stomach every time someone says that this time it's different. Why does this happen? Why, after so much evidence, after so many missed dates, does humanity continue to fall for the same trick? Why does fear always arrive punctually, even when the end of the world is always late, always rescheduled, always...
Stupid!
This is the most important question a human being can ask themselves, and it was answered more than 350 years ago by a man most people have never really heard of, even though Einstein publicly called him the greatest thinker who ever lived. Thou man who was expelled from his own family at the age of 23, cursed in a synagogue before the entire community, stabbed in the back in an assassination attempt from which he kept the torn coat forever, hanging on the wall of his room,
Dumbass.
as a silent reminder that thinking courageously has enemies. The name of this man was Baruch Spinoza. He was born in Amsterdam, the son of Portuguese Jews who had fled the Inquisition. He grew up among sacred books, ancient prayers, millennia-old traditions. But unlike everyone else of his generation, he did something extremely dangerous for the time. He began to think for himself. He started comparing texts. He began to notice contradictions. He started to see behind appearances a pattern that no one else dared to name. And when he finally had the courage to put on paper what he saw, the whole world fell upon him. Forbidden books, rejected homes, denied invitations. A lifetime lived in rented rooms in different cities in the Netherlands, with few clothes, little food, and a single wealth that no one could take from him. The freedom to think. He survived by polishing glass lenses, the same lenses that fueled revolutionary microscopes and telescopes that allowed humanity to see deeper into the universe. A perfect metaphor for the work he left behind. Lenses, tools to see what is hidden inside. And what Spinoza saw through the lenses he himself polished was something breathtaking. He saw that the end of the world was never a prediction. It was always a product. The most profitable, most enduring, most resold product in human history. A product that doesn't need to happen to work. In fact, it works better precisely because it never happens. Because if it did happen, the fear industry would go bankrupt. The genius lies precisely in keeping the end always close, always imminent, always a step away from arriving, without ever actually arriving. And this industry, my friend, moves a silent gear that sustains churches, cults, political parties, news channels, sellers of amulets, gurus, influencers, preachers, opportunists of all kinds. They all need to continue existing one single thing, that you remain afraid. Who profits from your anguish? How images of terror settle within you without you even realizing it? And most importantly, what is the exact path mapped out by him over 3 centuries ago to escape this invisible prison and reclaim something that fear robs from your life every single day? The present, the now, the only thing you truly have. If you've made it this far, there is probably within you, even if you can't name it, a deep weariness. Weariness of feeling fear without a clear reason. Weariness of waking up anxious. Weariness of listening to dark predictions that never come true, but still continue to steal your peace. This weariness is the entry point. It is what brought you here. Take a deep breath. Settle your body. Silence your phone. And come with me. Because the end of the world has always arrived late. But fear, that has always arrived ahead of time. And today, here. Now you will discover perhaps for the first time in your life exactly why. To understand what Spinoza discovered, you first need to understand who he was, and even more, in what world he lived. Because no idea is born in a vacuum. Every great philosophical discovery carries within it the scars of the time in which it was conceived. Amsterdam, the first half of the 17th century. A small city compared to the great European capitals, but bustling with life, commerce, ships coming and going loaded with spices, fabrics, forbidden books from all over. While the rest of Europe was still burning heretics in public squares, Amsterdam was a kind of oasis of relative tolerance. Jews expelled from the Iberian Peninsula by the Inquisition found there a possible refuge. It was to this city that Baruch Spinoza's parents arrived, still young, fleeing a Portugal that had forced Jews to become Christians, and then even so continued to persecute them, as if they were a virus to be exterminated. Baruch was born in 1632. He grew up speaking Portuguese at home, Hebrew in the synagogue, Dutch in the streets. From a young age he showed himself to be exceptionally bright. The rabbis saw in him a future spiritual leader. He read the scriptures with a facility that impressed the elders, but there was something strange about that boy. Something in his gaze, in the way he asked questions, in the way he remained silent in the face of answers that did not convince him. It was as if, from the very beginning, another voice pulsed within him. A voice that was not satisfied with the repetition of traditions, a voice that wanted to truly understand the why of things. At the age of 23, that voice spoke too loudly. On July 27, 1656, the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam issued against him the heaviest curse ever recorded in its archives. The original document has survived to this day, and when you read those lines in ancient Hebrew, you feel a chill. The community requested that he be cursed day and night. Cursed when lying down and when getting up. Cursed when going out and when coming in. No one could speak to him. No one could write to him. No one could read anything he wrote. No one could approach him within 4 cubits, which at the time's measure was approximately 2 meters. His own parents, his own siblings, his own sister, with whom he had disputed an inheritance shortly before, all of them forced to treat him as if he were dead. Imagine the weight of this. Imagine being 23 years old and losing, in a single day, everything. Family, friends, community, the name you carried, your entire identity. Imagine needing to reinvent from scratch who you are, in what language you will speak, where you will live, how you will eat tomorrow. Most people would have crumbled. Most would have begged for forgiveness, made public retractions, turned back on their own ideas. But Spinoza did something different. He did the rarest and most powerful thing a human being can do when the world collapses around them. He accepted, not with sad resignation, with clarity, with a kind of serenity that transcends the historical accounts of those who personally knew Spinoza and left records of him. Those who lived with him said he was one of the calmest, most smiling, kindest men they had ever known. A man who, having lost everything, seemed strangely at peace. Why? Because Spinoza had discovered something, and this thing, at its core, is the secret nucleus of all his philosophy. He had discovered that most human suffering does not come from what happens to us. It comes from what we imagine about what happens to us. It comes from the meanings we attach to facts, from the fears we project onto the future, from the frightening interpretations we build about the present. And when you can see this clearly, something very strange happens inside. A kind of silence, a kind of firm ground, a kind of freedom. Spinoza moved to a rented attic, first in Rheinsberg, then in Voorburg, then in The Hague. He learned a trade. He chose among all possible trades one of the most symbolic that exists. He learned to polish lenses, glass lenses. Lenses for microscopes that were beginning to reveal the invisible world of microbes. Lenses for telescopes that were beginning to bring distant stars closer. Lenses, in other words, that expanded humanity's capacity to see what has always been there, but that no one saw. And while his hands slowly turned the glass day after day, with an almost monastic patience, his mind built other lenses. Lenses made of words, lenses made of arguments, lenses made so that any human being at any time could place them before their own eyes and finally see what was hidden within themselves. It is with these lenses that we will work together from now on. Lenses that were polished over 3 centuries ago and that continue to function with impressive precision. Lenses that cut through prophecies, organized religions, collective fears, sensationalist headlines, apocalyptic sermons, and show on the other side a reality much simpler, much older, much freer than any story that has been told to you until today. Before diving into the heart of Spinoza's philosophy, I need to take you on a journey through history, a journey that might leave you with a bitter smile on your face. Because when you perceive the pattern, when you see the infinite repetition of the same trick, it is hard not to feel a strange mix of astonishment and relief. Let's start way back, 5,000 years ago. In ancient Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Sumerian scribes engraved on wet clay tablets predictions about the end of times. They described colossal floods, enraged gods, entire cities swallowed by darkness. These texts are so ancient that when they were first translated in the 19th century, archaeologists were shocked to realize that many biblical stories already existed, with different names on those tablets millennia earlier. Humanity had already feared the end even before inventing the alphabet. In ancient Egypt, priests warned that the Nile would dry up, that the sun would not rise again, that the pyramids would collapse upon the desert.
Damn it.
In the Hindu Vedas, sacred texts written over 3,000 years ago, entire universes are born and die in apocalyptic cycles. In each cycle, an entire era is consumed by fire, by water, by wind. In Norse antiquity, the peoples inhabiting the cold of northern Europe lived in expectation of Ragnarok, the final battle of the gods, where even Odin would be devoured and the entire world would crumble. Among the Aztecs in pre-Columbian Mexico, there was certainty that the sun required constant human sacrifices. Otherwise, it would cease to rise, and the world would plunge into eternal night. Every civilization, every continent, every century, always the same song. The end is coming, the end is near, the end is at the door. Let's speed up in time. Europe, year 999. A wave of panic sweeps across the entire continent. Preachers shout in the squares. Monks write hurried letters in their cells warning relatives and friends. Peasants leave their fields. Merchants abandon their shops. Entire families, convinced that the next millennium will not arrive, sell everything they own for pennies and set off on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. They want to be in the right place when the sky opens. And what happens when the clock strikes midnight on the transition to the year 1000? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. The sun rises, the birds sing, life goes on, and those people, now homeless, landless, familyless, have to start over from scratch, humiliated by their unbelief.
That's cute.
Year 1666. People, now homeless, landless, familyless, have
familyless. That's cute.
To start over from scratch, humiliated by their own belief. Year 1666. The date terrifies Europe because it carries the number 666, the number of the beast from the Book of Revelation. A great fire in London that same year is immediately interpreted as the beginning of the end. Thousands sell their possessions, cults multiply, self-proclaimed prophets appear on every corner. The year ends, the world continues. Year 1844. In the United States, a pastor named William Miller announces, based on calculations supposedly extracted from the Bible, the exact date of Christ's return. Tens of thousands of people convert to his movement. They sell farms, they abandon jobs, they wear white robes, they climb hills on the appointed date. They stand there waiting, looking at the sky, and nothing happens. The event would become known as the Great Disappointment. But the most impressive thing is that instead of the belief dying, it reorganized itself. Because that is what the fear of the end always does. It never dies. It just gets repackaged. Year 1910.
Now fuck up and take that poem.
The passage of Halley's Comet near Earth causes global panic. A French scientist claims that the comet's tail contains cyanogen, a toxic gas, and that it would poison the atmosphere. Clever businessmen quickly start selling gas masks, miracle pills, anti-comet tablets. People lock themselves in sealed basements. A young woman in Chicago even commits suicide to avoid the poisoning. The comet passes. Nothing happens. Year 2000. The Millennium Bug. Governments spend billions. Families stockpile food, water, candles, weapons. Airports prepare for chaos. The turn of the millennium occurs. Nothing collapses. Year 2012. The famous Mayan calendar. The whole world holds its breath on December 21st. Movies are released. Books are sold. Conspiracy theorists make millions. The day passes, no one dies. And here lies the most extraordinary point of this entire story. With each failed prophecy, instead of becoming more skeptical, people become more vulnerable to the next one. Instead of learning from the mistake, they erase the mistake from memory and believe in the new prediction with the same intensity. It's as if there exists within the human mind a door that never closes, a door that reopens with each generation to welcome new sellers of the same old product. Spinoza was one of the first men in history to look at this pattern with open eyes, and what he saw there, in this pattern, was profound. Because to understand why fear always arrives punctually, one must understand something very deep about the human mind, something that almost no one teaches. Something that, once learned, changes everything. There is a question that Spinoza asked, and that very few philosophers before or after him had the audacity to formulate so clearly. The question is this: if the end of the world has never come, where does the fear you feel come from? It seems like a simple question, but think carefully. If the cause of fear is not the end of the world itself, because the end of the world has not happened, then the fear must be coming from somewhere else, from somewhere within you, from some mechanism that does not depend on the real event to function, from something that generates the emotion of terror without needing the terror to be true. Spinoza named this mechanism. He called it imagination. But be careful, because the word imagination for Spinoza does not have the poetic sense we give it today. It is not the faculty of artists. It is not the ability to create magical worlds. For Spinoza, imagination is something much more precise and much more disturbing. It is the way the human mind mixes images, memories, words, fears, desires, inherited traumas, and produces from this mixture an internal reality that overlays the external reality. In other words, your mind does not show you the world. Your mind shows you the interpretation it makes of the world. And this interpretation, most of the time, has nothing to do with the world itself. It has to do with the scars you carry, with the sermons you heard in childhood, with the movies you watched, with the news you consumed, with the books you read, with the dreams you had, with the conversations you absorbed without realizing. You do not fear the end of the world because the end of the world is happening. You fear the end of the world because your imagination, fueled by thousands of apocalyptic images accumulated throughout your life, constructs within you a vivid scene of destruction, and your body reacts to this imagined scene as if it were literal. Spinoza went much further than that. He described, with the precision of an anatomist, how this process works. When our mind forms an image, no matter how much that image is only mental, the body responds physically as if it were occurring in the real world. The heart rate accelerates, breathing changes, muscles tense, glands release hormones. It is a war without an enemy, a race without a finish line, a flight without a hunter. And here is the detail that changes everything. Imagination is not something you consciously choose. It operates below consciousness. It works on its own, automatically, reacting to stimuli that you often do not even realize you have received. A headline that flashed quickly before your eyes, a phrase someone said on a bus, a video that played while you scrolled your finger on the screen, a sermon that stayed with you from childhood, a phrase from your grandmother said 20 years ago that you swore you had forgotten. All of this forms a silent collection of images within you, and this collection, at certain moments, activates, combines the images, constructs scenarios, and produces emotions. That is why the fear of the end of the world is so effective. It does not need to be true to work. It just needs to find, within you, pre-existing images that fit. If you grew up hearing about hells, just one catastrophic news story is enough for the flames of those images to start burning again. If you watch disaster movies, just one distant earthquake is enough for your body to feel the tremor as if it were there. If you read about wars, just one conflict appearing in the news is enough for a diffuse anxiety to invade your chest. Spinoza understood that all of humanity lives in this internal theatre, and that, as long as a person believes that the theatre is reality, they will never be free, because they will spend their entire life reacting to ghosts that they themselves project, while true reality out there remains simple, present, concrete, silent. But there is more. Spinoza realized that imagination has an even more dangerous characteristic. It associates. It connects things that have no logical relation to each other. If you experienced an earthquake as a child, and it was raining that day, it is possible that, for the rest of your life, rainy days will awaken in you a subtle anxiety that you do not even know where it comes from. Your mind associated the two events, and now one triggers the other. This is how prophecies work as well. They associate in your imagination a present event, like a war, a pandemic, an economic crisis, with apocalyptic scenes stored deep in your cultural memory. And this association, made in fractions of a second, produces within you the conviction that the end is near. But this conviction is false. It is a trick of the imagination. It is the same trick that made people in the year 999 sell their homes, that made people in 1844 wear white robes, that made people in 1999 stockpile food for the millennium bug. The same trick, the same mechanism, the same ghost. And the first thing Spinoza proposes as a path to liberation is exactly this: to learn to recognize when imagination is in control, to learn to distinguish between what is really happening and what your mind is projecting onto what is happening. This distinction seems small, it seems obvious, but when you truly train it, it transforms your entire life, because you realize with astonishment that 90% of what you call reality was in fact just imagination dressed as facts. Now I need to take you to an uncomfortable place, a place where most people do not like to look, but without going through it, nothing that Spinoza discovered makes complete sense. So prepare yourself, because we are going to talk about the elephant in the room. We are going to talk about who profits from your fear. If the end of the world never happens, but the fear of the end always returns, punctual, relentless, it is because someone is keeping this mechanism turning, not necessarily through conspiracy, not necessarily through conscious malice, but through a much simpler and much older mechanism, the mechanism of interest. Where there is collective fear, there are those who benefit from it. Spinoza lived in a world where this was explicit. The church of the time controlled entire populations by selling indulgences, signed papers that, for a fee, supposedly shortened the time a relative's soul would suffer in purgatory. In other words, the Church first instilled the fear of eternal suffering, and then charged to supposedly alleviate that same fear. A perfect business model. First you create the problem in people's minds, then you sell the solution. Traveling preachers went from village to village, painting vivid pictures of hell, grotesquely describing the torments awaiting sinners, filling small rural churches with trembling peasants. And at the end of the sermon, they would extend the basket to collect coins. Each coin placed there was, in fact, a desperate attempt to buy a little relief, a little hope, a little protection against the imaginary fire that had just been described. This same business model Spinoza realized with horror extended far beyond the church. Kings used it to keep subjects obedient. If you, peasant, dare to question the king's authority, not only will God punish you, but the entire cosmic order will collapse and the world will end because of you. Astute rulers have always known that a frightened people is a controllable people. A people convinced that the end is near submits to anything, accepts any sacrifice, obeys any order, as long as some chance of salvation is promised to them. Now update this mechanism for today, and look around. Really look. News channels that thrive on catastrophe. The scarier the headline, the more clicks it receives. The more clicks, the more advertising. The more advertising, the more money. The algorithm learns that good news does not engage. It learns that what sells is terror. And so calmly millions of people are fed daily with a diet of industrialized fear, because fear is the fuel that keeps the machine running. Modern preachers, in gigantic temples and digital broadcasts, following the old model almost unchanged. First they describe the abyss, then they promise the lifebuoy of salvation, and they pass the basket. Only now the basket is a bank account with pics available, and the sermon is broadcast live to millions of people at the same time. Sellers of miracle courses that promise to prepare you for the imminent economic collapse. Sellers of supplements that promise to protect you from a future pandemic. Sellers of survival courses that promise to teach you how to build the perfect bunker. Self-help gurus who promise to save you from the financial bankruptcy that, according to them, will soon hit everyone. Conspiracy influencers who profit from absurd theories, selling access to closed groups where, by paying a monthly fee, you will receive the supposed forbidden truths. I'm not saying that all catastrophic information is a lie. Real problems exist. Real crises exist. Legitimate concerns exist. What Spinoza shows is something else. He shows that around any real problem, there almost always grows a parallel industry that inflates that problem, until it transforms it into an imminent apocalypse, because the imminent apocalypse sells more than any well-measured real problem. And here is the hardest part. You, I, all of us participate in this without realizing it. Because we click, because we share, because we comment, because we feed, with our own attention, the mechanism that consumes us. Fear is, today, literally, a currency. Every time you spend your attention on apocalyptic content, someone somewhere is making money. Every time your heart races while reading a catastrophic headline, an algorithm notes the data and triggers the next even scarier content, because it learned that you react to that. Spinoza, in the 17th century, did not know algorithms, but he knew human nature. And he warned, with impressive clarity, that those who learn to manipulate the fear of the masses become the true owners of the masses, even without needing to use swords, armies, or palaces. Just master fear, and you master bodies. Just master bodies, and you master wallets. Just master wallets, and you master people's lives. The mechanism is functioning right now, while you listen to this. But there is good news, and this good news is the heart of Spinoza's philosophy. None of these external forces have power over you if you do not give power to them. This entire industry depends to function on a single raw material, your unregulated imagination. The moment you learn to regulate your imagination, to distinguish reality from projection, the entire mechanism loses the fuel that drives it, and you suddenly become a strange, rare, almost unconquerable person. This is the path we will walk together. Step by step, we have reached the heart of Spinoza's thought, the point where everything organizes itself, the concept without which nothing he wrote makes sense. This concept has a technical name in Latin, which I will give you shortly. But the most important thing is not the name. It is to understand the idea behind it, because it is perhaps the most powerful key to inner freedom that any philosopher has ever produced. Spinoza divided human ideas into two large categories: inadequate ideas and adequate ideas. And the entire life of the human mind, according to him, is an oscillation between these two ways of thinking. When you have inadequate ideas, you suffer. When you have adequate ideas, you free yourself. As simple as that. As revolutionary as that. What is an inadequate idea? It is a partial, confused, fragmented idea. It is an idea that sees only a part of reality and confuses that part with the whole. It is an idea that arises not from understanding, but from the immediate reaction to stimuli. It is the idea of the frightened animal that sees a shadow and flees, without stopping to discover whether the shadow was that of a predator or a tree. It is the idea of the child who hears a strange noise at night and immediately constructs a monster under the bed. It is the idea of the adult who reads a headline about war and immediately convinces themselves that World War III has begun. The inadequate idea always has the same structure. It reacts. It does not investigate, it feels, it does not understand, it concludes before analyzing. It jumps from effects to causes without reconstructing the real path that connects the two.
Damn it.
And for that reason, it almost always errs. What is an adequate idea? It is an idea that sees the causes, that understands the why of things, that situates the phenomenon within the entire chain of factors that produce it. An adequate idea for Spinoza is when you see the event in its entirety, with its connections, with its origins, with its functioning. When you have an adequate idea, you are not shaken by the event. You understand the event. And to understand is, for Spinoza, the only true form of freedom that exists. Let me give you a practical example, because this may seem abstract, but it is extremely concrete in real life. Imagine two people listening to the same news on the newspaper. The news is about an impending global economic crisis. The first person, who thinks with inadequate ideas, reacts immediately. The heart races. The mind begins to project terrible scenarios. They imagine losing their job. They imagine their family starving. They imagine social collapse, looting, violence in the streets. In a few minutes, this person is already sick with anxiety over something that hasn't even happened yet. They spend the night sleepless. The next day they make poor choices driven by panic. They sell stocks at the worst moment. They cut essential expenses. They break plans. They suffer the apocalypse in their imagination even before it possibly arrives. The second person, who thinks with adequate ideas, hears the same news and does something very different. They pause. They ask questions. They investigate. They seek to understand the real causes of this crisis. They discover that similar crises have happened in the past, and that humanity has survived all of them. They observe what they can and cannot control. They make rational adjustments where it makes sense to do so. And they continue living their life calmly, because the understanding of the phenomenon has stripped it of the frightening power it had while it was just a headline. These two people heard the same phrase, but they lived completely different realities, because the first was enslaved by an inadequate idea, and the second freed themselves through an adequate idea. Now comes the most important part. Spinoza asserts, with a calm conviction that permeates his entire work, that every inadequate idea can, with effort, discipline and practice, be transformed into an adequate idea. In other words, no one is condemned to live as a slave to their own projections. There is possible internal work. There is a path. There is a method. And this method has a name.
Not!
He called it, in Latin, via de comprehension. A slow
Not!
A path that does not promise instant miracles. A path that requires you, in the face of each strong emotion, instead of reacting, to pause and ask, where does this come from? What are the real causes of this fear? What is actually happening, separate from what I am imagining about what is happening? What part of this fear corresponds to a real danger, and what part is pure projection of my imagination, fed by everything I have consumed throughout my life? When you train this kind of question, something strange begins to happen. The emotions do not disappear. Spinoza was not a naive idealist. He knew that we are bodies, and that bodies feel, but the emotions lose their tyrannical power. They cease to control you. They become merely signals, information, data about your internal state, which you can observe with curiosity, instead of being swallowed by them. This change is what Spinoza calls the passage from servitude to freedom. Not a political freedom, not an external freedom, a much deeper and much rarer freedom. The freedom of no longer being a slave to one's own mental images. And the end of the world, my friend, is a mental image.
Don't even think about it, slut!
An image trained over millennia. An image carefully fed by entire industries. But still, just an image. The moment you learn to look at it as an image, and not as reality, it loses its ability to bind you. And you regain something that perhaps you never realized you had lost. You regain the present. For Spinoza, understanding emotions was as important as understanding physics, mathematics, and astronomy. He dedicated an entire part of his greatest work, the Ethics, to the study of what he called the passions of the soul. And in doing so, he produced a cartography of human emotions that, even 3.5 centuries later, remains one of the most precise ever written. Spinoza had a phrase that summarizes this part of his philosophy. He said, with almost surgical calm, that men consider themselves free only because they are aware of their desires, but remain ignorant of the causes that determine them. Let that phrase sink in slowly. Men consider themselves free because they are aware of their own desires, but are ignorant of the causes that produce those desires. What does this mean in practice? It means that you think you want what you want. You think you chose to be afraid of the end of the world. You think you chose to worry about what you read in the news. You think you chose your anxieties, your beliefs, your opinions. But Spinoza looks at you with that serene smile of someone who has seen it all and says gently, none of this is choice. All of this was caused. And as long as you do not see the causes, you will continue to be driven by forces you do not understand, believing that you are the one in command. The passions for Spinoza are exactly that. They are states of the soul that arise not from understanding, but from reaction. They are internal movements provoked by encounters with the external world. You encounter something that increases your capacity to exist and act, and you feel joy. You encounter something that diminishes your capacity to exist and act, and you feel sadness. From these two primary emotions, the entire complexity of human emotional life is built. Love is the joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause that enhances us. Hatred is the sadness accompanied by the idea of an external cause that diminishes. Primary emotions, the entire complexity of human emotional life is built. Love is the joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause that is built. Love is the joy accompanied by the idea of an external cause that enhances us. Hatred is the sadness accompanied by the idea of an external cause that diminishes us. Hope is the joy projected into an uncertain future. Fear is the sadness projected into an uncertain future. Look at how Spinoza defines fear. An inconstant sadness, arising from the idea of a future or past thing whose outcome is doubtful. In other words, fear, by definition, depends on ignorance. If you knew for certain what was going to happen, you would not feel fear. You would feel, perhaps, preparation, sadness, joy, resignation, depending on the case. But fear, no. Fear lives precisely in doubt, in lack of information, in the void between what is known and what is imagined. That is why the end of the world is the perfect fertile ground for fear, because no one knows, no one has data, no one has certainties, and in the void of this ignorance, the imagination plants its monsters. But Spinoza goes even further. He realizes that each emotion, once it settles in, strengthens ideas that help perpetuate it. A person afraid of the end of the world begins, without realizing it, to select information that confirms the fear. They start to pay attention only to catastrophic headlines. They begin to follow only apocalyptic channels. They talk only with people who reinforce that same fear. In a few months, the whole world for them seems to be collapsing. because they have built around themselves an informational bubble that only shows scenes of ruin. And this bubble feeds back the original emotion. Fear attracts ideas that strengthen fear. A cycle forms, a spiral, and the longer the person spends inside this spiral, the harder it becomes to get out. That is why seeing someone trapped in the fear of the end and trying to argue rationally with them rarely works, because they did not arrive there through a rational path. They arrived through an emotional path, and every rational fact you present is immediately reinterpreted by the emotional spiral to confirm the fear itself. If you show positive statistics, they say they are manipulated. If you remind them that previous prophecies failed, they say this time is different. If you ask for calm, they say you are naive. There is no argument that can win an emotional spiral through purely rational means. Spinoza discovered this and, for that reason, did something very rare in the history of philosophy. He refused to combat emotions with ideas. He understood that only a stronger emotion can overcome another emotion. Emotion is overcome with emotion. The emotion that Spinoza proposes as an antidote to fear is not courage, as many would think. Courage is still a reaction. Courage is still within the same logic of struggle. The emotion that Spinoza proposes is something much more subtle and much more powerful. He calls it active joy, the joy that arises from understanding, the joy that comes from seeing reality clearly, the joy that comes from understanding calmly and deeply how the world really works, instead of reacting to the ghosts that the imagination produces. This active joy is what will gradually free you as you progress on the Spinozist path. It does not come all at once, it comes gradually. With each adequate idea you conquer, with each new understanding you add, each time you realize that an old fear has dissolved, not because you fought against it, but because you understood it. And with understanding, it simply lost its strength. The moment has come to face one of the boldest, most disturbing, and most liberating ideas in all of Spinoza's work. An idea so revolutionary that it was probably the true reason for his excommunication, the prohibition of his books, the persecution he suffered for the rest of his life. An idea that even today continues to be rejected by many religious traditions, despite having fascinated minds like Einstein, who openly declared belief in the God of Spinoza. The idea is this: God and nature are the same thing. It is not that God created nature and then stood outside observing, like a watchmaker who finishes their work and leaves. It is not that God is above nature, in a separate heaven, judging human beings and preparing punishments. It is not that God resembles a giant human being with a white beard, feelings, anger, personal preferences, none of that. For Spinoza, all of this is human imagination projected onto the cosmos. It is the human being looking at the universe and seeing in it an amplified mirror of themselves. For Spinoza, God is the entire nature. It is the totality of reality. It is the only infinite substance that exists, and of which everything we see is merely modes, manifestations, expressions. You, I, the cat in the street, the distant mountain, the star light years away, the invisible bacterium in your intestine, all of these are expressions of the same unique, infinite, eternal reality. This totality is
I wasn't black.
Indiscriminately.
I was
God
not black
or
and
nature.
let the game abort.
In Latin, Deus sive natura. God, that is, nature. This idea seems almost simple when we state it like this, but think a little about its consequences. If God is the entire nature, then God does not have anger. Because nature does not have anger. If God is the entire nature, then God does not prepare punishments.
This is such
because
horseshit.
nature does not prepare punishments.
God is a
If
person.
God is the entire nature, then God is not angry with humanity and preparing an end of the world to punish it. Because nature is not angry with humanity. Nature simply is. It follows its laws, it operates according to its own internal logic. And
Nice
earthquakes,
try, but this is
storms,
horseshit.
diseases, catastrophes that happen are not divine punishments. They are merely natural consequences of natural processes. Do you see what this single idea makes collapse? It makes collapse all at once the foundation of millennia of apocalyptic prophecies.
Horseshit.
Because all prophecies, without exception, presuppose an emotional God, a God who is disappointed with humans, a God who decided to act, a God who will judge, a God who will execute sentences. If God is not emotional, if God is the total order of nature, then all this edifice of fear collapses. Not because tragedies do not happen, they happen, but because they cease to have a cosmic moral significance.
But what they fail
cease
to
to be
understand
messages.
is
They become merely occurrences within the natural functioning of the universe. This change of perspective is gigantic. It removes from the human being an anxiety they have carried for millennia. The anxiety of being constantly under the observation of a superior entity that can take offense, take revenge, feel resentment, act according to moods. Spinoza suggests that the universe does not care about you in the sense of being
that's
angry
what it
with
is.
you,
But
also not in a cruel sense. The universe follows its eternal laws, and you are part of those laws. You are not outside of them. You are an expression of them. You are a wave in the ocean, not a separate drop that the ocean could punish. When Einstein wrote in a famous letter that he believed in the God Spinoza, who reveals himself in the ordered harmony of what exists, but not in a God who occupies himself with the fate and actions of men, he was in fact repeating, in other words, what Spinoza had written 300 years earlier. And when physicist Stephen Hawking, in his popular books, spoke of understanding the mind of God as understanding the fundamental laws of the universe, he was also not always naming it, drawing from the same source. But you do not need to be a theoretical physicist